The church is not for one group, one ethnicity, one culture. The church is truly where all are invited and welcomed and loved. And Epiphany proves that. The festival that we're celebrating today shows that this Savior born in Bethlehem is the Savior of all nations, of all people. Think, for example, about the wise men that we read about just a little while ago, where in Matthew chapter 2 it talks about the wise men coming to visit baby Jesus. There are a lot of surprising things that happen in that chapter, aren't there? Some very shocking things. You have a star that appears in the sky and miraculously moves about and points out the exact house where the child is sleeping. You have grown men, foreign dignitaries, coming and opening their treasures and presenting a baby with gold and incense and myrrh. Some surprising things happen, but the most surprising thing is that these men were not Hebrew Israelites that came to worship Jesus, but in fact, they came from the east. These were foreigners that came to worship the newborn king. Matthew wrote this biography of Jesus for the purpose of convincing the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, that the Hebrew scriptures, that the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets pointed toward. The purpose that Matthew had in mind when he wrote this was so that the first century Jews would come to realize that Jesus is the Christ. And so he wrote this with them in mind, and that's why many times in Matthew's gospel you'll read things like, as it is written, or this happened to fulfill the words of the prophet, and things like that. And so imagine you're a first century Jew, and you've been told your whole life that you are God's chosen people, that the Messiah would come from your bloodline, from your family, that the Redeemer would be a relative. And you hear now that there is a book that proves that Jesus is actually that Messiah that God had promised long ago. And so you open up that book, and in the opening chapters, you read about foreigners coming to worship him. That would be a major light bulb moment. And that's the kind of light bulb moment that Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 3. That's where we're going to spend a little time this morning. And as we look at that, I hope that we too have a light bulb moment to realize that this Savior is born for all the nations. And it's only by God's grace that we know him, and it's by God's grace that we get to share him. Here's what the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 3. In reading this, then, you will be able to understand my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the people in other generations, as it has now been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets. He says that there is something that previous generations didn't understand that now we have a better grasp of. And what is that? Well, in the Old Testament, it may have seemed as if God were lavishing all of his love and attention on a single nation. But we have to remember that from the very beginning of time, God had made his love and promises available to all people.